Um, and it was interesting because the conference, while it was like well received, it wasn't as well as attended as I think even the organizers were anticipating. And one of the things I thought was interesting is one of the people got up on stage and they were talking about DevOps, and they go, yeah, for so long they thought that DevOps was a solved problem, like, not really a solved problem, but like, oh, we need to solve this. Let's solve this using DevOps. And so then he goes, we added environment creation automation, and that didn't really get us anywhere. So I mean, we were doing DevOps though. I'm like, that's not really the lesson from DevOps. Like, you took one part of it, but you didn't do everything else associated with DevOps or continuous delivery or any of the other agile or any of like Kanban or anything like that. Like you take one lesson from it, you do it, or you think you're doing it, but in fact you're not doing it. I don't know if Steve, if you've seen that as well when you talk to folk.
Yeah, I think there's two mistakes. One is adopting one practice out of myriad practices and then thinking, why is this not working? And it's,
Yeah.
well, it depends on a lot of other things that support and amplify it. I think Ken Beck gets the credit for that spider web of a diagram of all of the extreme programming practices, and there were lines between loads of them because it's like, well, they all support each other. You can't do
Yeah.
one of these on its own; doesn't do anything. Um, I think the other one is that, especially with DevOps, I keep getting told that we don't know what DevOps is. Um, and I think like the very simple version of DevOps is it's development and operations collaborating better, and then hopefully
Yeah.
you align their goals to make that easier to do. But after a decade of research, we've got a really good model built by the folks at Dora that says, here is a whole list of things that can help you, but the list is so big, you need to think about what your challenge is and then go back to the list and say which of these things will help us with our challenge. And over time, you'll build up a whole set of practices that work for your specific context.
Mm.
But yeah, one is not enough.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
thought the same. I thought the same thing as well because I mean we don't know what DevOps is. I'm like, there are three books out there written by the same group of people telling you what DevOps is. You got the DevOps handbook, you got the Phoenix Project, you got the Unicorn Project, and then you have the inspiration behind a lot of the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project in terms of the way that it was taught, which is the goal. And that, Gene Kim said it in one of his podcasts or one of his, I can't remember, podcasts or on stage or whatever, and he said, yeah, the goal was a huge part of DevOps and the whole concept of theory of constraints. So again, it's like we don't know what DevOps is a bit misleading because I mean there's a barrage of in materials that is out there just focused in on that. Like if I look at my bookshelf, I mean I can see four books right there. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd accelerate to that list.
yeah, exactly.
That's definitely one, and probably extreme programming explained and
Hmm.
continuous delivery because
Exactly. Yeah.
a lot of that stuff turns out to be the right idea. And I think at the
It.
moment up here somewhere, The Goal is one of my featured books that I've put at the top
Oh
of my
yeah.
bookshelf.
Oh, that's what it
Uh,
is.
It.
I hated the idea of a business novel because I read a lot of books, and when someone said, "Oh, The Goal," it's like it's a business novel, so it's
Yeah.
about learning how to do cool stuff at work, but it's written in the style of and I was like, I'm a grown
Don't
up.
like that.
I don't need to be fed information in this way.
Yeah.
But then I read it and I was like, okay, I'm wrong. It's such a
Yeah.
good book.
It is a good book. I won't lie though, towards the middle of the book when it was talking about his relationship at home, I was like, because I was listening to it on an audiobook, I'm like, skip, skip, skip. I was like, I want to get to the good stuff, like, because I mean, I'm walking my dog and everything like that. I was like, I need to get. It's like I'm trying to get to the good spot when I'm walking the dog. Like I'm trying to get to the lessons here. But it was a fantastic book and everything like that. But I do agree, like, so it's funny because they all fundamentally say a lot of the same thing, which is, work in smaller batches, restrict the amount of work in progress you have, and focus on delivering changes as fast as sustainable and safely as possible, as opposed to just like throwing a bunch of crap at the wall. So it's I think it's funny that almost universally, like almost everyone agrees that those are kind of the core concepts that you need to focus in on, and it's not I need to automate my environment creation.
Mm.
Yep, done.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting about this huge amount of agreement for working in small batches, being iterative. The thing that makes me laugh about this is if you go back and read Herbert Bennington's paper from the Sage project, which is ancient in software terms, it said the same thing. He
Yeah.
said we dedicated a percentage of our time to building the tools that would help us work instead of actually working on features. We kind of built our tools because they didn't have the kind of tools we have these days. They made them themselves, and they had to invent like a different type of storage, like hardware, as part of their project. So it was quite different to what we do. But they said the same thing: start with something small and iterate. And everyone has said, everyone who's come up with the method has said this at some point. Um, like it's strange how it won't catch on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even Fred Brooks said kind of the same thing in the Mythical Man month, which was the second system effect, where like you build a small system. I think the analogy wasn't it was like an outhouse, and then on top of it was like the world's most perfect bathroom that was like 7 stories tall, because you take all the lessons from the first thing that you build and like, oh, I'm going to try to cram as much, stuff as I possibly can into it. But, you know, it, he warned of it even back then. So, I mean, clearly we've known these are big problems and we need to solve them, but we just seemingly insist on relearning it. What I think is kind of funny about a lot of it is just that I've worked for companies, I'm sure you've worked for companies where it's deploying frequently or deploying to production was such a big ordeal and it's so risky that the business naturally said, do the riskiest thing less often. And so then we're like, okay, now let's get down to quarterly or 6 month releases, and you end up batching up all of these changes and ironically, in trying to make something less risky, you make it even more risky. Because again, you're violating the whole concept, which is work in small batches, control the amount of work in progress. And when we say control the amount of work in progress, until something is pushed out to production, it's not done. That's still in progress. That's still in flight. So that's the key thing is like in order to pick up the next thing, the other thing has to be pushed out to production for people to start using it rather than trying to batch up 20 changes and hope for the best type of thing.
Yeah, I think it's tempting to say it's done because you're not planning on looking at it again. But when it lands in front of users, they'll have feedback, they'll have ideas to improve it, and you want to still have that context in your head so that
Yeah.
you can get back into it, make it better. Instead of it being 6 months later when, you know, oh, Tony wrote that and he's not in this department anymore. He's working somewhere else. It's like, oh, okay, so now we have to kind of warm everything back up and get it running again. I suppose from the risk point of view, as humans, we tend to like walking around on 2 legs, but this is
Yeah.
inherently risky because you can trip over and you can bang your head on things, right? So maybe we should all carry on crawling like we did when we were toddlers, because if you fall over when you're crawling, it's a much shorter drop and your head's lower, so you bang it a lot less. But and that's kind of a choice that people are making.
I think back to the back, back to the working in iteratively and getting the feedback. When you are iteratively building features and functionality, using things such as like trunk-based development, small batch sizes, you're building out the functionality and delivering small pieces of it at a time. Once you release it to the users, it may not be every user. Maybe you're using a feature toggle and you're limiting the amount of users who are actually using the new feature. They're giving you feedback. Your mindset is still in that whole feature because you're continuously building on top of it. It's not the feature itself isn't done. Now, maybe that small piece of work that you just did, that's done and that's out in front of users, but maybe they give you feedback, but you're already in that mindset. You're already thinking about it. Your team's still focused in on it. Your product manager's still working on building it up. So that's I think that's one of the big reasons why, we've really been kind of pushing in on more of this whole feature toggles, leveraging trunk-based development, and then also leveraging things like progressive rollouts. So you can have the zero downtime, eliminate the deployment risks with a blue-green or canary or even rolling style deployments.
Yeah, it
I,
totally makes
I,
sense to just gradually let people see it, get some feedback, make it better. I think maybe in a way we're really worried about what someone will say about our feature. We're feeling a bit too
Yeah,
precious about it, so we just keep polishing,
yeah.
right? And we kind of want it to be perfect, but it never will be based on just our opinion.
I think you may have answered the question that I was just going to ask, both in the last parts of that conversation around risk and just continuously trying to make it better before you put it out. But the thing that came to my mind is, are there any other, what are those big rock reasons that people don't embrace it? Because I think on paper the concept is like, yeah, this makes total sense, but there's something happens between the logic and the realistic sort of output within that, where not always, but sometimes it falls over. And risk is one of them for sure. And people say, oh, it's not right just yet. I'm not putting it out. I think they're probably the two big ones. But is there anything else in your
So
experience?
when, yeah, so when I mean, I've joined a number of companies, and you always hear about back in the day. Back in the day, we used to be able to deploy directly to production, and we didn't have to talk to anybody. But inevitably, you would have some sort of outage. Inevitably, you would have some sort of critical issue. And so people would put a policy into place as a natural reaction, as a way to prevent that from ever happening again. And so you slowly over time, you put these friction points with the idea that we're going to have more people have more eyes on this to prevent this from ever happening again. But eventually you get to a point where getting something up to production, you have to go through so many different yak shaving exercises, for lack of a better term, that you're just like, it'd be better if I just had to only go through this once a day, or I don't have to go through this once a week or once a month. Um, or it could be something like when I worked at a company and we could only deploy 2 a.m. Saturday, because that was literally written into the contract, not because that was what we felt like doing. And no one wants to deploy every Saturday at 2 a.m. I mean, that's insane. And so you're like, okay, I only want to do that once a month or once a quarter. So you start, all of these little things start adding up over time, and then you slowly start adding and building your features as a reaction to that, because you're like, I only want to go through that whole workflow and that whole process unless I'm 100% sure it's going to work, or I am confident that this quote unquote feature is done. Um, which is an unfortunate thing in my world. And I don't know, Steve, if you had other experiences on top of that.
Well, it's making me think. It's like a self-fulfilling destiny because
Yeah,
if you deploy every 3 hours, there's like two lines of code have changed, right? The
yeah,
risk of that deployment is so low. Um, and that fear of deploying makes you store more and more changes. And so it is going to be a painful deployment because there's so much change in one go. It's going to hurt. And so the fact that that is then your reason for deploying less often, which means you're then making it even more painful, it's like a really
yeah,
terrible cycle. And I think that's quite common to a lot of problems in knowledge work come back to that same problem where there's a positive spiral that you can find, or there's a really negative spiral that you can find, and they kind of amplify themselves. So the people that work out, they start kind of limiting their work in process, and they find that somehow they're getting more done, even though they're slowing down. It's like that's strange. And then the people that are doing bigger and bigger batches are getting slower and slower, but they're like, it's because our batch isn't big enough. Like if we
yeah.
didn't have to pause and do this deployment, we could have done more work or something. And so it's like it
Yeah.
literally is either you kind of fly off happy or it's just like down and down, getting
Mhm.
worse.
And you actually, and you saw that even they even talked about that in the goal when they had these big batches that they'd send to the heat treat plant or one of the other machines that they had to worry about. But it would take forever to get it all set up. And so their concern was, oh my gosh, okay, well, it takes an hour to get set up. So we got to make sure we have everything ready to go for that 1 hour. Sorry, everything ready to go to make that hour worthwhile. But then you end up in a situation where the machine is barely being used, or it's not being used because of a variety of different reasons. The batch size isn't quite ready yet to be pushed out there. And so you end up constraining your bottleneck even more.
Yeah. We do this whenever we move house, right? Because you
Yeah,
pick up a box and you think, well, I'm gonna have to walk all the way over there with this box. I'll try and take another one. And you're trying to work out how, like, you get to the point where you're doing four boxes at a time, and then you come back and there are five boxes left, and you're like, well, if I do four boxes, then I'll have to come back and just get one. So now I'll try doing five boxes because I don't want to do an extra journey. But it's
yeah,
like it's so much easier just to do the extra journey. It's
yeah.
quicker, it's easier, it's safer.
Yes. One one other thing, I can't remember if this was a blog post or something I might have been something you written, Bob, but where does or what are your thoughts on where like a change approval board sits within this realm? there's pros, there's cons. I can see Steve's face. This is a can of worms.
But
I I have I believe so. I think that a change approval board, when done correctly, serves a good purpose. I believe that too many companies don't do it correctly, and so they get a really bad name. But ultimately, a change approval board should be a tool to make sure that you don't have any conflicts if you're going to be deploying that day. And there's other apps that are about to go out. It's just making sure that you have the appropriate resources ready to go. You're not going to end up in a situation where one app going down or updating is going to cause an issue with another app. So it's just kind of allowing you to do something like that. Uh, and I've been a part of a change approval board where that was the sole goal. It's like, hey, we just want to make sure that everything's good to go. But ultimately, the decision to deploy that was pushed down as far as possible to the business owner who had the most context, the business analyst, or the business analyst who requested the change, and they say, yes, this meets my requirements, and I feel confident this is ready to go. Not a change approval board who's going to approve all of the changes. That's they don't have the context. They don't know all the ins and outs. I mean, asking someone, hey, do you know understand this change that's about to go out to a SAN? I mean, the chances of a SAN expert being in the room go, yes, that sounds reasonable. That was going to work perfectly. No, it's not going to happen like that. So I think the change approval board can serve a purpose if it's done correctly. But oftentimes I think they're just seen as well, that they almost see themselves as a tool to say no to prevent production from quote unquote going down. And I think that's the problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
I kind of agree with that. I think so. We know lightweight change approvals is one of the capabilities that have been researched by Dora. And so lightweight change approvals are very important. Um, I think the way you described it about how the change approvals should work is reasonable. I think what I've seen a lot is um, change approvals where all of the work has been done, the company has spent the money, and then the work gets taken into a room filled with people who really don't understand why the work was done. And then people have to explain what they did and why they did it. And it's almost like a court case. And then at
Yeah.
the end of it, they kind of get a judgment. And you think, just in terms of running a business, wouldn't you want to have that conversation before you spent the money?
Mhm.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. One of the companies I worked at, there was a change approval board every day at 11 a.m. And if you had a deployment going out that night, you would walk up to a big whiteboard right next to where they met, and you just wrote down your application, and that was it. And you walked up, and then at 11 a.m., you walked up there. You said, this is going out. This is the time it's going out. We have the resources, and then the it was like 4 or 5 people, and then any other applications that were going to go out that day would also be there. And so, oh my gosh, you're going out? Okay, you're going out at 7 p.m. at the same time. Hey, why don't we hold off and we're going to go out at maybe 7:30. That's all it took. No, I never was at these change approval board meetings that took longer than 5, 10 minutes at most. But you hear about these horror stories, like you just said, where these change approval boards take half a day and they only do it once a week. You're like, oh my gosh, that's crazy to try to run a business that way.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think a
I think
little
it,
bit of flight control is needed. That's the
Yeah.
idea, is you just want a bit of coordination. And, if you can walk up to people and chat about it, or you can use a visual signal for what's going on, that's great. You
Yep.
don't need to find like, I mean, I've seen change approval boards where it was effectively like the executive team
Yeah.
being brought in to do change approval because I guess no one else wanted to be responsible for saying, yes, this stuff's going live. So it just kind of like floated all the way back up to the very top of the organization. And that's just such a waste of time. The people
Yeah.
furthest away from the context having to make a decision just isn't effective.
I do think that if you adopt what continuous delivery teaches, like actually practice what they teach, the small batch sizes, separating the concept of deploying a new version from releasing new functionality, leveraging things like feature toggles to hide the functionality from the majority of your users until it's ready to go. I do think that that then becomes less of a concern with change approval boards because you are making changes to the system that are less risky, that requires that kind of coordination. So I think it's just kind of also a sign of the maturity of an organization. But again, you can automate your entire deployment pipeline all the way up to production. You can get to once a week deployments that take you 15 minutes, and you don't have to fundamentally change how you make the changes inside of your application. You don't have to do things like change your branching strategy or change your, adopt feature toggles or anything like that. You can continue working as you've always worked, but then if you want to get from once a week 15 minutes, you're going to have to implement those changes in order to satisfy that because you can't have a change approval board if you want to deploy every 3 hours. That's just a non-starter because there's no way they could keep up. There's no way any human could keep up to try to coordinate all of that, especially across an organization. If you have 100 app teams deploying every 3 hours, I mean, that's impossible.
Yeah, but also at that stage, there's each deployment contains a much smaller amount of change.
Exactly.
So maybe you don't need so much coordination. And I think there's a bit of discipline around it about, making sure if you have an API and people depend on it, there's like ways of managing that with versioning or with
Hmm.
non-breaking changes, So yeah, I think it depends on some discipline, but you should just be deploying each time something is ready, like each time you've validated that that is fit for purpose.
I think, yes, as the last time we chatted, you talked a little bit about the concept of resilient deployments. So trying to anticipate the potential problems that could happen and you make your deployment process a bit more resilient to account for that. Now, you can't account for every possible error. That's just the way of the world. I'd also make the argument that your applications should also be resilient in that sense of, okay, if I'm calling out to a third party API, I have to work under the assumption that it could go down. And if that does happen, I don't crash my entire application or leveraging things like using message queues or message buses, and so the application that accepts the messages that never, almost never, ever goes down, and it has load balancing and everything like that because essentially it's just a dumb application. It just takes a message and goes, "Yep, I'm going to throw it on the message queue. Happy days." And then you have all the work behind the scenes. That's what gets deployed, but the front end, what people interact with, that doesn't change at all.
Yeah, and that's a great way of handling it because what you've got there is you've built the robustness because it's much easier to make your message queue highly available than your
Yeah,
entire backend stack, right? So that's now nice and robust. And ideally, a backend system disappears. It still accepts messages. When the backend system comes back, it manages getting those messages through. And then occasionally there'll be some message that cannot get through for some reason. And that's when, like, someone goes and looks at that stuck message, works out what went wrong. They fix that message and they maybe increase the robustness to a future message that's similar. So,
yeah.
yeah, it's such a great way of handling it. And I used that. I had a application that used to speak to the database directly in the back end,
Hmm.
and it was just a really bad way of doing it. And we decoupled it just with a simple queue, and it was super easy because we were going to be sending a JSON message back to the backend API, which then spoke to the database. So you've already got a perfect message. It's just like you ask the message queue, just hang on to this and make sure it eventually gets delivered. And one time, ideally, you have to build a bit of
Yeah.
idempotency in there to make sure that if it's trying to deliver a message and it keeps getting accepted, and yeah, you have to be a bit cautious. But that's again, it's easy to handle, and it's such a standard pattern now that it shouldn't cause you a problem.
Yeah. And I think the point is that if you want to solve some of these more people problems, I think it's just rethinking how you build your application, how you build your functionality, how you architect certain things to allow for that so they can be decoupled, so they can be independently deployed without bringing down the entire system. Like we had one application that a company that I worked at, it was so mission critical that if it ever were to go down, all of the other apps would go down with it. And that's a terrible burden on that development team. Like you have to be perfect 100% of the time. I mean, how can you even achieve that? So
Yeah, it's out of your
decoupling,
control.
yeah, so working through the whole effort of decoupling eliminates a lot of those dependencies. And again, these aren't really deployment problems. These are just architectural problems that you have to address.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's always going to be something which isn't software related that's going to stop that from being
Yeah.
available for whatever reason. And I always think it's interesting, service level objectives from Google's SRE kind of world. I quite like the concept that you shouldn't exceed your SLO for too long because that's what causes people to then depend on your application being available because it
Yeah.
never fails, right? You don't want, if you've got an SLO of 90%, but you're actually achieving 100%, that's a bad thing because no one's going to write the code that says, try and call this thing. And if it's
Mhm.
not available, do this alternative.
You've created the I think they call them the Rambo services, as in they can never fail.
Very good. I think that is a good place to wrap it up with John Rambo. Did not expect to hear that coming in.
Well,
I can't
it'd
remember
be
where I
funny if
read.
they were
I can't
called
remember
John services.
where I read
Like,
that. I read that somewhere, and I was like, that's that's there are services like that.
Yes.
They can never go down. They can never fail. It's like,
yeah,
jeez.
it makes me laugh how often it's people put a cache in
Yeah,
just to make it better performance, and then the cache has a problem, and that just absolutely crushes the whole system
yeah,
because they haven't thought what happens if I can't get to the cache.
yeah.
They like depend on it so much.
Yeah.